All right, so for this lesson, we'll be doing the power of positional chess. And for this one, I'm going to do the isolated queen's pawn. Let's hopefully see if we can get through most of what I brought. Now, everybody knows that the isolated queen pawn, an isolated pawn is a pawn that is on its own. It can also be called the IQP because this is the queen's pawn. That's why they call it isolated queen's pawn, for those who didn't know. And yeah, the isolated D pawn is strategically rich and should be well studied for both sides. Now, in this, we'll be looking at different plans for both sides of a position, for white and for black. Against black, black's going to try and blockade this pawn over here. You see, white's goal is to try and push the pawn to d5 and exchange over here eventually. Black's goal is to try and play knight b4 and d5 to make sure this pawn doesn't get pushed. In the middle game, this pawn will, which I'll explain more detail later, in the middle game, this pawn, the isolated pawn, is all right. It's okay how it is. But if you get to an end game still having this pawn here, it can usually end up being a lot of trouble. And most of the time, if that happens, you will be the one on the losing side. So that's why it's always white's goal to try and get to d5 first without allowing this to be blockaded. So yeah, in an endgame, it will be attacked and won easily. So the side with the Isulani pawn will have two open files, the E and the C file for the rook. Now here's a start of a game on how we get there. d5, this is like the most common way. For any of you who know the Queen's Gambit decline, d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, c4, e6, that's your Queen's Gambit decline, e3, c5, knight c3, knight c6. There are many ways to get to the isolated queen's pawn. There's quite a few, but this is the most common and just a simple example I'm going to use. So if you want an isolated queen's pawn here to give to black, you must play captures on d5 first, not c5. Because if you play there, then your opponent could take here, and then no side would get an isolated queen's pawn. So that's why you always take c takes d5. He'll take back. Then you take there, bishop takes. So now your opponent is the one with the isolated pawn here. And then your goal will be eventually knight b5 and then knight d4. Likely exactly the same thing, it's just opposite. Earlier on when I showed you was black's idea, but more commonly we will see positions of isolated queen's pawns from white side. Usually it's takes, or you get the other line here, bishop d3, takes, and now white's the one with the isolated pawn. So here, the problem with an isolated queen's pawn is, in my opinion, one of the most important problems in all positional play, which is true because, as we always say in chess, if any of you know this part, or chess player Adamus Philidor, he was the first person in the 1700s to actually realize the importance of pawns back then. And he said that everything in chess revolves around pawns. because of the structure where they are there. Depending on where they are placed, they make weaknesses. They can give you strength. And yeah, there's an upside to them and also a downside. So here you'd have a weakness, and over here you have like a strength. E5 is a good strength for the knight, which we'll go over a little later. But yeah, the isolated queen's pawn, note, is an outpost for the knight on E5, and for the black knight on D5, that is the outpost. Over here in this one, this diagram, I'll be showing you a few examples over here. So we'll be going back and forth on it. So I'm going to go and jump quickly to this one. As you see, this is how you will see an isolated pawn structure. Imagine no pieces, right? And we've come to an endgame like this. So both kings would eventually travel down. Now, when this king is attacking this pawn, the only piece to defend this is your own king. So if you get to an endgame, like I said earlier, and you still have the isolated pawn here, whichever side has it, whether it's black or white, that is the side that's going to struggle and be under pressure throughout the rest of the game. Because you're going to be stuck to defending these, and eventually, yeah, black should win the game, but it still depends a bit more on what happens if they know what they're doing. But yeah, it will be more difficult for the person with the isolated pawn if it comes to an endgame, especially if you still have like maybe a knight on the board or bishop or rook. If you have a piece, it will be even more difficult to hold. Okay, so the dynamic power of the D4 pawn, that's what we're going to do now in this chapter. So the dynamic power of the D4 pawn lies in its lust to expand, to advance to D5. And further, the fact that it protects and creates an outpost on C5 and on E5. Right now, we have outpost, but it's attacked by the pawn, so it's not useful. But most commonly, the outpost used here will be the E5 one for the knight, because sometimes you will have threats, such as knight takes on F7, and when you see the bishop eyeing from A2 to G8 here. So if you have a nice little trick, sometimes like this, possibly, see, it can end up being quite dangerous. Right now, it will not help you, but sometimes it can be very good. So that you can use tricks like that. That's something just to watch out for in the future if you ever play this. So yeah, and this is how white will create his outpost. And opposed to this, black's outpost is on D5, as I've said before. In the middle game, it does not offer full compensation, all right, for black having this outpost. But if he has the outpost when it comes to the end game still, and you haven't been able to get rid of this pawn, it's going to become a bit of a problem for you. So yeah, I'm going to have to scroll a little down here. White can point out to the fact that the knight on E5 here must have a much more incisive effect than the opposing black knight on D5 ever could. For it is evident that the knight on E5 is backed up by two powerful bishops, this one and this one over here. If you can have a powerful bishop here and one looking over here, or even here and it's looking there, you can really place your opponent's king under serious pressure. And you can get yourself a good kingside attack. Now, the isolated pawn at queen's pawn has a endgame weakness. Our judgment of our problems we have just outlined, that's everything we've just read about, influenced by the fact that e5 here and c5 have different effects in the endgame than it is in the middle game. For a later stage, if white doesn't get a kingside attack and it's no longer a consideration, then e5 will start to lose its strength, while black's d5 square will gain strength. Does everyone understand that?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So d5 over here will be much stronger than e5 does in the endgame, because if you do not get an attack in the middle game with the knight on e5 over here, this place starts to lose everything, and yeah, then you have failed with this line. Then white will start suffering, and not only that, then white will also start suffering from the lack of protection of the isolated pawn, but also the fact that the light squares on d5, c4, and e4 can become weak. White's weakness in the endgame is an example based on the fact that the d4 pawn will come under threat, and the d5 point is extraordinarily strong. Further, the light squares of d5, c5, and e4 will always tend to be weak. So the idea for black here will be to play knight c8 first, because his idea is to try and check the king, chase it away, so the black king can get d5 here. If you try this thinking to stop that, you always have simply just knight d6 as well. The king has to move somewhere, say back, for example, d5. And now this pawn is going to be a problem. Now, of course, you aren't going to win the game immediately or anything. Yes, black is much better here, but still you've got a lot of work to do to prove you've got a win here. But this is a definite win for black, but you just have to play it correctly. So now we'll have a look at some games by top players. Domotov versus Larson. Now, Larson was one of the strong players in the 1970s and 60s, also up to the 80s. But unfortunately, in this game, Domotov beat him. Larson was one of the icons I studied in my youth. e4, c5, let's get to the position, d5. A Slav game we have here, and now it looks exactly like a Queen's Gambit decline. See, this position here, same as we saw earlier on. Takes, castles. See, now he's trying to get ready for the advance of this d5 pawn. But also, just because you have the option now doesn't mean you can do it. Timing has to be right. Your pieces also have to be more well placed, and you need more development. Don't rush in for it. An important thing is timing it correctly. Remember, positional play isn't about looking for playing aggressive or anything like that. It's about taking patience and timing things right. Back. Just to stay out of the line of b5, coming up next. And now he times it right. Another move besides b5 was, was knight c6 instead of playing there. Knight c6 was another move. d5. And now this is something you must remember. This is a very important part. The side with the isolated pawn should always first plan for the advance of the pawn. Since then, you will have all the spatial advantage. And then you will not have any disadvantage of the isolated pawn. So once that disadvantage is gone, you don't have to worry about that. And you will have a huge amount of space. So let's see how when the game carries on. Takes, knight takes. Now, bishop b7 was played here. Knight was played, queen, takes, takes, a7, and rook e1. And this leaves black very cramped and undeveloped. So that's why he played bishop b7 here instead, trying to get some development and activity. Knight takes. Now the bishop is important to exchange since it protects all the weak black squares. Now we will have this for our bishop to come, and all these squares I marked here, all the dark squares are weakness because all the pawns are on light squares. Rook e1. Queen c5. Now watch this chase. Bishop e3. Knight h4. Queen e4. g5. Queen c6. Rook c1. Queen b6. And this is a beautiful game over here played. So yeah, this is the advance of the d pawn. Now here is another one. I'm just going to jump it to the spot, which we must be at. Okay. Now a3 here. When you get a chance here, you should play a3 first. Sometimes before trying to play this, okay? When you play a3, you prevent knight b4, d5 from ever being a problem. So you've taken away that option of blacks. So no more maneuvering. As also to know in another lesson in the future I'll teach, maneuvering is also a type of positional way of playing. So yeah, black's idea is always to maneuver the knight to d5, and here you prevent it. And this also allows the bishop to drop back to a2, so you can be away from a distance if it gets attacked, and you can keep it on the board and eventually push d5, and then it follows by queen d3. The idea of that is to keep an eye on h7, and sometimes you can play the bishop, which is on a2, back to b1. Then you will have both the queen and the bishop looking at h7 for mate, and you have your bishop here threatening to take to checkmate, and you connect the rooks at the same time. So there's a lot of strategical ideas that can come from playing with an isolated pawn. a6, queen b3, b5, a2, b7, rook a d1, getting ready to try and push the pawn, rook c8, rook fe1. Here, d5 does not work. Takes, takes. That's what I thought the first time here. When I was doing this, I thought it was just takes and you win a pawn. But I forgot that when you allow this, the bishop on g5 would have. So yeah. And black has a good position for the little loss of material. In the final game, looking at an attack from the A2 to G8 line here, and the B1 to H7 diagonal. This one is Artur Yusupov and Eric Lebron. This game was played in 1996. So, yeah, here we are. Yusupov plays A3, E7, C2, E8, Queen D3. So here you've got yourself attack against the king. Lots of pressure. And if you can get your opponent under pressure, sometimes they'll crack under it. And they'll play the wrong move and lose. Okay. Now this next one, the isolated pawn as an attacking instrument in the middle game. Solidity in the build-up of a position should, at the first sign of its neglect on the part of your opponent, for example, when he has removed his pieces from the castle position, give way to a violent attack. So more or less, when now you can see this whole position, this is a nice and solid position we've got here. All right, all the pieces are placed nicely. But at the first sign that your opponent starts to neglect the rules and give way for a violent attack, the attack itself will arise. For example, when black removes the knight from F6, from the king side knight here, to D5, it's natural square since the knight wants to go there. Then you're going to expose the king to becoming attacked. And that's going to start ending up giving you problems. And there will be a bit of a test later on that. So here will be the test. Now, afterwards, we'll look at the game. Now it's just a bit of a test to see how your attacking ways will go. So here in the game, black played knight e8. All right. His idea was to play d6. How do you think white responded to knight e8? Try to figure out the attack here. I'll give you a minute to try, 2 minutes actually, to try to figure it out, the line. So 98 was played, now it's white.
I think I have it.
Okay.
After knight to e8, bishop takes h7, king takes h7, queen to h5 check. Um, then after king g8, we have bishop g5, I think. That trapping the queen.
Unfortunately, that's wrong. After knight e8, when you take, king takes, of course, right? Then you say check, king goes back, and now you said then bishop g5.
Bishop g5.
Yeah. Okay, I could have a look at playing probably knight just back to f6 then. And then there's no mating threats. Plus, at the same time, remember your queen's on h5, so you threaten to attack the queen. Or I could play pawn f6, attacking the bishop immediately, preparing maybe queen f7, wanting to try and exchange queens off. But there's no mate threat. See, your pieces you don't have enough pieces to get there in time.
I think I have the move.
Okay, give it a try.
How about you try after knight e8? It's black to play, right? So after knight e8, knight c6 can be played with the plan of exchanging off the bishop and to like kind of move, to like kind of try to move our rook here on d6 and our bishop to go on f4.
Okay, remember part of the lesson before now? The idea of the lesson was here, if we go back. Remember, I said solidity in the build of a position. If your opponent, remember all these pieces, they're all solidly placed in the right spot here. Now, if you neglect it, like moving this piece, for example, this piece is defending the king, right? Keeping an eye on it. Say you move it away to here, d5 for an example, or e8. This is the square it should belong on. Then a violent attack can arise. So that's why I'm trying to show you in this game over here. So we're not interested in going after this bishop here, really. When you look at it in the next one here, we're not interested in the bishop here. What piece we're interested in looking at is the king. The king is the target here. Okay. Knight here. Probably just bishop takes, rook takes. And yeah, then you've lost your powerful knight on e5. Remember, that's your strong piece, your outpost. For the isolated queen's pawn square, remember, creates an outpost for this knight here. And this knight is a strong knight. You don't want to swap this off for a piece that's not good. Check the pieces for the strength. This bishop isn't really doing much exactly at the moment. Yes, it's eyeing down here, but not much. You're the one who's got the pieces that are looking at attacking.
Oh, okay.
So if knight e8, then I'm going to show you the game now. So, all right. I put all of this in here. So if knight e8, then comes queen h5. g6. You also have f5, but that just allows bishop g5 now. After g6, queen h6. Remember, you've got yourself a possibility of looking eventually at bishop and knight takes and then queen takes here. A possibility. And you've got the threat of eventually the bishop coming here looking at this. Or even looking at f6 as a weak square. Knight g7. g5. Okay, the pieces now come out of reserve. So they've all been sitting here waiting for something. And now here it comes. F6. And here, this beautiful move. Bishop G6. With the threat of mate. Now, can anybody tell me why he plays Bishop G6 here? What is the threat?
There is a threat of mate on H7, queen takes H7, and if the queen were, before playing bishop to G6, if the queen were just to take, maybe black would escape.
Yes. So, but what would you play up? So black takes here now, right? Continue the line.
Yes.
I want you to try now from here, continue the line here. See how far you can get.
You are attacking the queen at the same. Knight takes.
Okay. Knight takes, and you've got a very nice board. And not just that, you've also got queen here as a threat. Because the idea you have to watch out for is eventually the knight coming back here. So let's see how he plays it. Now there are two spots for black. He's got either queen d7 or queen d6. We'll have a look at queen d7 as the first one. And over here, this is where he gave up. Also possible was takes. Takes, check, then check. Captures, check. So it's 3 pawns for a piece. And if d6 is played, and it's over. Can't take, because knight takes check. And you have threats such as rook over here takes on e6 next to come. So yes, if your opponent breaks the rule and moves the defending piece at a point away, when you have your knight here and your bishops looking towards the king with the queen, and your rooks activated as well, then you can start going for a nice violent attack against the king side. So that's only if they break the rule of moving the piece away. Now, which cases are favorable for white and which ones are for black? In general, it might be said that white should strive for the two following cases. One, when he has forced his way through d4, d5, eventually, and then pawn captures here, as we see, with pieces recapturing, thereby obtaining better play due to the centralized game. And I'm going to show you an example of it over here next in Rubinstein versus Tartakova. And also, when he has built up play along the C file, that's another thing white strives for here, play on the C file. And for black, he strives all the cases to be an endgame player. With an isolated D pawn, remember, black always wants to try and keep it solid and locked and go for an endgame. make sure the pawn stays stuck on d4. And yes, in those cases like knight takes d3 or c3, it has been played, fixing pawns and then laying siege. Now that is when I'll be teaching you just now about a pawn pair. So here, the part over here when d4 and d5 is played, game Rubinstein. So you got ourselves into another Queen's Gambit line. Okay. A4, we don't take immediately, because if we take, then black gains a tempo with b5, attacking our bishop. So that's why we played a4 first. c5, takes. Castles, takes. d5. E takes, knight takes. Takes and takes. Now, do you see all the spatial advantage you have here as white compared to black? Plus, your pieces will be developed quicker. And black still hasn't castled. That's what he's got to do. So yeah, you're going to activate your pieces more quicker. And this pawn on b7 will always have a bit of a problem for a while. You have a powerful bishop in the center. But one of the weaknesses you'll have to remember that white will most commonly have is the b2 pawn will always be a weakness.
Please, could you go back to the game?
Yes.
Please go back a bit to the beginning. Yeah. Yes, there. When
Yeah.
before that. Yes, when black played to black played to b4.
Okay, when black plays b4, yeah.
Yes, can't you check with the bishop? Then when the rook takes, you play.
It's a smart trick, but it doesn't work. Take a closer look again. Why? I'll give you a chance yet. Figure it out. Or can anybody else figure it out as well? Why doesn't queen takes f7 work yet?
The black bishop will be there to block.
Exactly. Because if you take, doesn't work. Got that. It's a good idea and try.
That's the same thing
it doesn't work.
With the bishop, right? When you like take with the bishop.
You take with the bishop, then that doesn't either work. Got there. Check. Then I can simply play here. Or you also have the option of playing here as well. Because queen check here or something like that, thinking the king moves away, still doesn't work because you've got the queen and the bishop both defending the rook. And so it's not enough.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. If anyone else has a question, just ask. Okay, yeah. Now it's to teach you about the isolated pawn pair. So this one on its own over here, right? You see the pawn I've circled. That itself is just an isolated pawn. All right? But after you play knight takes here and pawn takes back, here you've got yourself an isolated pawn pair. Okay? Now, then it would be your goal is black. Your goal would be to blockade these pawns. All right? Like get a rook or a knight or anything to stop it and prevent this pawn from being pushed. So your goal as black here in this position would be to prevent this pawns from moving at all. Because this is what we call a backward pawn. It's weak. If you could play a move, for example, like this, that would be blockading it for now, the moment. And if you have other pieces, this will eventually become a problem, because it will eventually allow pieces such as the king or anything else. I'll show you in games as an example just now. See, eventually the king can come here and this will be a problem. Or possibly something else. But what you must make sure is that whoever possesses this isolated pawn pair must do everything in their power to try and play c3 to c4. Because he must not allow his opponent to blockade him at all. And also c3 and the pawn on d4 is cumbersome. How can I put it? More like passive. It's uncomfortable. It will give you problems later in the game. And it's the same thing if it is black, having the pawn here on c6 and a pawn on d5. The exact same goes for black. So here we'll have a look at a game using one of those as an example. Two, knight takes. Rook b8. Okay. Queen c2 is played here because it tries to, he doesn't want to play b3 here. Now it looks very nice because it's defending, prevents the pawn from being attacked by the rook. And if he takes here, ever, then you always can take back here with the knight if you want to. But he plays here because he wants to have the option of playing queen a4 or knight b3, knight d4 later as well. So that's why he's not playing there. He's keeping his options open.
Couldn't he like try like the knight? Couldn't he also like try to move to f3, then jump to d4?
Yes, but before you look at that, look how powerful the bishop is here. And look what it's targeting. These are weak pawns, okay? See, for example, you putting pressure. What we have in chess as well, when you have the further, you've got something called a strong point, okay? Each side. Whichever pawn is furthest pushed in the game. Hold a second. Whichever pawn is like the furthest pushed. This one is farthest pushed ahead, like here. This is called a strong point. So you must attack and put pressure on it, all right?
Yes.
So, and also, these pawns are doubled, so this is already bad. Putting pressure on this doesn't mean you need to take, but if you play knight here, right? The bishop loses a bit of its strength. Playing knight here, rather, instead, you don't lose any strength. You do block the attack, one thing you achieve, and then you have the option of playing there or there next. Because if you play knight d4, you threaten knight to capture on c6 after the knight's played b3, d4, knight c6 with a 4.
Okay, okay. Thank
Now,
you.
your opponent will probably see it and he will not allow it to happen. But if I were you, I would rather play knight here, b3, because I'd like to keep this open and activated. Rook e8, e3, bishop e6, takes. Now, also, as I said earlier, knight b3 was also a move to be considered. Takes, and knight d4 was another line to play. But take a look how bad it is. Look at all those pawns. Triple pawns and an isolated pawn. This is horrible. There's no ways I dream of wanting to have a position like this. You do sacrifice a pawn for the moment, but in the end, look how bad his pawn structure is. Yours is still perfect and fine. And you are eventually going to win one of the two pawns back, as I especially say you'd probably win either, most commonly, the c6 pawn or the c4 one. One of the two you will win back. Then you'll be equal, except your opponent will just have bad pawn structure. And if you can survive this like all the way to an end game, with them still having this terrible pawn structure, then it should be easy pickings, a bit of a not too difficult game. If most pieces are swapped off and you have all these bad pawns. C takes d5 now, after pawn takes. Now, I know we're doing a lesson on an isolated pawn pair, right? Now, black has this notorious isolated pawn pair, but for this notorious isolated pawn pair to work, you need the pawn here, you understand, on c6. If the pawn's on c7, like it is here, then you only look at this as a isolated pawn. Everyone understand that? So that's the difference. If the pawn's here, then it's a pawn pair. But if the pawn, even if it's next to it over here, but it's on c7 and not c6, then you've just got an isolated pawn. Don't forget that. That's something that can get you confused. You can make a mistake. I did it a few times when I was playing in games. And when my coach tested me on it, I made this mistake as well. And then the last one of them is called the hanging pawns. So we've done three: an isolated pawn, an isolated pawn pair, and now we're going to do the hanging pawns. So there is a family tree that we can learn from it. The advanced in a block position, and what it means by blocked, it means, let me give you an example of it, just so you see. This is a block position, okay? So with respect to these highly problematic dual-natured entities, there are only two things that can be regarded as established. One, that the two hanging pawns are unprotected. For example, they are not protected by their own pawns, and that they will be bombarded along open files and will in, sorry, can't scroll down a second, and will in full view of pawn exposure inevitably be more troublesome. Two, the fact that this possibility of obtaining comparatively safe positions with the two pawns is because they can protect one another. So yeah, hanging pawns can sometimes be good, but other times they're not so great. So this is an isolated pawn. This is the family tree, the isolated pawn, which is by itself here. Here you've got your hanging pawns, your isolated hanging pawns, sorry, on c6 and d5. And here you've got your hanging pawns when they're next to one another. Hanging pawn plans. There are two pawns adjacent to each other. By definition, they are not weak since they have the ability to defend each other. With either advance, meaning you can either advance c4, c5 or d4, d5. Here are the different plans in such a position. The side with the hanging pawns, one advancing the d pawn or advancing the c2 pawn, or you are defending. So you either can advance them or you could be on the defense with them, because they also are good. Look at the amount of space these two pawns control. All those squares. Takes the option of the knight out. It takes the open file chance from the rook away. And yeah, it takes away the d5 square for the black knight. So yeah, you've got some good things come out of it, but also it can, as they say, be bombarded or attacked on the open files. So yeah, you have to be very careful still. Here we're going to use a few games for an example, okay? To look at some of these played. Now for the first one of the hanging pawns, we're going to look at when you advance the d pawn, all right? So let's go to the game. d4, d5, c4. c5. Here, takes and takes. And here we've got our hanging pawns. d4, advancing it. Confidence for tactical potential. So he's hoping for tactics to use in this one. Now, if the d pawn advance cannot be refuted, cannot be stopped, it will always threaten to become a pass pawn. So if you cannot stop it, there's always a threat of it becoming a pass pawn. But it doesn't mean it's the end of the world or you're losing. Knight a4. Takes. It was also, to look at this, takes, takes. Now, this is not good for white. This becomes a good game for black. Because of this. Now you've got the threat of it. Discovered attack somewhere moving anyway. And whenever you play using these pawns, the b pawn always is a weakness. And now I will show you when the c pawn gets pushed in the next game. Going a bit ahead of myself there. 2. Centralizing the queen. Lots of activity, very nice, but fortunately, it's not going to help you. b3. And black's chances for winning are very good here. So in this game, Boleslavsky managed to win a rook for a knight and eventually win the game. This was one of the world championship matches played in 1972. Spassky versus Robert James Fischer versus Boris Spassky. Now, this is plans against a hanging pawns in the center when you advance it. So now we're going to look at how we can actually beat these pawns. He makes a mistake. Yet. Okay, so we get to this point. C8. 5. Now this move is not so great because you can't take because of queen takes rook. Two, knight d4. And this move is a mistake here. E4 is a good move. He should have played knight f6 here. E5, d7. See, keeping it solid still. Instead, this time when advancing the pawn, this turns out to be a mistake. F4, and the idea is to fix the weak pawn. Now, does anybody here know what fixing a pawn is? Okay, that's when you play a move like e5 to come eventually next to make sure this pawn can never be pushed. There's nothing protecting it, for example. So this pawn will become a fixed pawn, and then it will become a target because it's on a light square. And you could have a look at the bishop going, attacking, and the queen attacking as well. So he's looking at making it become a target. When you play e5 as well, you take away the option of f6 for the knight. And you see, Fischer has also managed to blockade these two pawns. You see, the rook and bishop controlling it. They're doing a good job. These two will be able to blockade these pawns and you won't be able to get through. And queen h3, so after bishop c4, and you got queen h3 targeting. That leaves you only with either rook b6, knight f8, there's knight f8, f5. And you've created yourself, what do we call this type of pawn? Anyone?
A pass pawn.
That's right, pass pawn. So yeah, now you've got yourself a pass pawn, which is a strength and can be very annoying for your opponent. Plus, the knight doesn't have activity, stopping that there. You also threaten possibly rook f7 eventually. You've doubled your rooks. Rooks are still in the corner doing nothing. Queen d8. The king side is very weakened. e5. Three. And we can stop here because black has no more useful moves in this game. It's over. Sorry about that. this last game over here is attacking the C pawn by advancing the B pawn. So let's get to main pawn. Okay. So what type of pawns do we have here now? Can anybody remember what these type is called?
You said it was the isolated pair.
Correct. Isolated pair of pawns. Yep. G3, H3. Black is not interested in the A pawn. He's just advancing the queen to be more active. And also, he might be looking at C3. And now, what must you do whenever you have a isolated pawn pair? What is the thing that you must try to do as quick as you can?
You must try to push them.
Push which one?
You must try to push them. The one that is behind. Then after
The
that, you
C4.
can.
That's right. C3, C4 is what you must play. Correct.
Yes.
That's your goal. That's exactly what Gulfan played here. C4. So you get rid of that weak problem. Plus, it makes it nice and solid. So you see, like the previous games I've showed you, it's a similar position, not the exact same. So when you go and play yourself, the idea of looking at these classical and positional games is if you get, say, a similar position, remember, you'll never get the exact same, but something similar. You can use the ideas that you learn from here and input it into your own game.
How about
Yes?
if like the white queen takes your pawn, because isn't your pawn weak?
Be very careful where you're placing the queen. You might get the queen itself trapped. So maybe you can take, but also be careful of being greedy. It's very dangerous. And I put in an example. So knight f8 was played in the game, but if you played, like you said, queen takes, right? This would be very dangerous. There. Bishop d6. And queen e2 is winning. Queen's lost. So you trap the queen. Now this is quite a line to find. So yeah, 4 moves you have to look ahead. So yeah, most commonly most players will do when they see something like this, you'll probably just play queen takes. You don't want here, we don't want to take queen because we want to keep the queen here. This comes here to take away control of dark squares. This pawn controls that square. This rook controls this entire line. This queen cannot be played anywhere here. So the queen's got pretty much almost nowhere to go other than here. You cannot play queen takes here eventually. So say I take, you can't play queen takes there because it's check. Takes, and you lose the queen to a discovered check. So that pawn is invulnerable, cannot be touched. Queen is trapped, and your threat is to play here and win the queen. The queen goes there, then you will just play rook to a3, attacking the queen. And then there's no choice. Queens run out of squares to hide.
Okay.
So do not be greedy. The queen was only placed here for activity, because where the queen was earlier on over here, it's not so active, right? If the queen is here. Here it's a little more active. At least you can look here and maybe be looking at a bit of play here. So only reason is to be active. Not every move must be about attacking or capturing. When you're playing positionally, you want to try better your pieces. That's the goal. Place them on better squares, improve them, maneuver them around, even if it takes a move or two. It's not all about being aggressive and attacking and swapping pieces off. In most of the games I play, usually I only swap my first piece off by around move 18 or 20. Sometimes last 3 years ago, I played a game and only one piece was swapped off and I resigned. Because I could see a huge attack coming and I wouldn't be able eventually to stop it. But yes, I recommend don't just swap pieces off. Try to keep them on the board. Queen F8, F4. So you've got yourself your outpost here. Here, pawns have done well so far. But it's trying to break them. So knight d7. But this keeping an eye to try and stop you from playing d5. And here is the movie play, b5. Sorry, here. So destroying the b pawn, destroying the c pawn and attacking it, while the d4 pawn will become weak, because if you push this pawn now, then the knight gets an outpost eventually. Or even if it's not the knight, d5 becomes an outpost. If you take, same thing. Maybe even a move such as queen to d5, threatening mate.
How about if you
Possibility.
first took the knight off the board with bishop takes f6? You first take both knights off the board, then you push.
He decided not to. This move loses for black. Because of check, check, and you lose the queen. That's one of white's ideas here. So he's not interested in the attack of the pawn. He's just trying to generate an attack on the king side himself. So yeah, he wins a pawn, but it's an isolated queen's pawn. Question is, will he be able to hold it? And eventually he does. Now the bishop's on e4, more active and better. Black is starting to look better. Now you've got this defending here. Then you eventually will look for pressure because the rook will be here attacking. The rook over here. c8. And you've doubled the rooks onto c5. And you've got the queen attacking. So you're placing pressure. And remember, over here you've got 2 pawns versus 1 for the endgame. Possibility. Ignore this one. Okay. Now, you can have a secure position here, like it's saying you can have a weak c5 pawn, as you can see it is here. It's being attacked by the knight, rook, and bishop. 3 pieces. But you have yourself a strong pass pawn. So remember, whenever you get the hanging pawns, depending on whichever one you push, if you push the d4 pawn, usually it will always become a passed pawn, but depending on how strong it will become, depends on your position that you already have before you push it. Now here, the d4 pawn is a product of both having a hanging pawn on c5 and d5, and eventually was pushed. Now the goal would be to play e2, f8, and here, king d3. That's how you blockade it, and this is how you would keep an advantage. If you try to blockade it, for example, d3, yes, fine, you don't get the pawn or anything, and you're trying to double up, but it will never work, because your opponent will just do the same. And remember, now you've got 1, 2, 3, all of this attacking on here, yet it can do nothing. And how much time do we still have? 15 minutes. Now this one is advancing the c pawn. Now when we advance the c pawn in this one, I'm going to show you that there's a bit of a downside for it, because, I mean for white, because white's b2 pawn will be weak. When we advance the d pawn, this pawn is still fine to push. When you advance the c4 pawn, it gives pushing b3 a bit of a problem. And we'll get there eventually. Let's play it out a bit. Knight takes, and there we've got it. h6, a strong move. C. The c pawn is advanced. It's very strong here because black already controls the b file. There is no pawn here this time to stop it. Plus, this is already a pass pawn, which is also very annoying, because now what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to be very careful. If you play this wrong, you will lose this game. The b file is now ready to invade white's position via b3, and then go to d3 is a possibility. So the b file is an invasion square. Knight c5, possibly for d3, or you've got here eventually. Maybe even knight to a4 to attack here, because this pawn, or this bishop, sorry, is protecting the a pawn. And maybe if you swap that off, you can have the queen and rook staring down at it, and maybe win that pawn. It's difficult to get this because they're on light squares. You've got a dark square bishop. You have a knight and a queen protecting. And this one over here, not much to do. e5. This is an attempt to get counterplay by centralizing the queen, which is met by queen f8, which will allow black to continue this invasion plan. Knight d3 takes, and this is where Domotov plays the wrong move. Okay, his pawn takes, which was incorrect. He should have played queen takes, was much better. Rook b1, h6. Defending against all possible back rank mates, and this should be enough to win, since the a pawn is too weak, and the c pawn is very advanced. This pawn will eventually drop. This is weak. This is a very powerful knight. So, unfortunately, he missed this. Even the best of the best miss sometimes simple stuff. So he'd have to actually give up this just for any chance, but it's still winning for black. So because he missed it, Yusupov played this to an endgame. He's transposing. Now, he can't play rook takes because he's written mate. It's the knight covers, g7. White has only f2 as a weakness, making it difficult for any attack or progress. Trying to play here to maybe bust through won't work because you've got a knight on d5.
Couldn't you like try to march your king toward the knight?
Yep, he's trying to march the king this way towards the knight. Because also this pawn is attacked. If he doesn't do something, there's a possibility of playing knight takes.
Oh,
Knight takes check, and then the knight can just come back to where it was. So you've got a threat. So that's the one threat over there. And then they agree to draw here. So, yes, a very fascinating way to play against c4. And this last game to show you. Allowing pressure on c5. This is when you use the d pawn yourself. It's not an isolated pawn game, but it's when you explore this pawn to try and make it be a weakness. So when you've got it here as an isolated pawn, you see this over here. This is a bit of a problem. So d4 is now a weakness. Now, if you were white, or black, sorry, how would you play from here? After this move, black to play. Try to find a way to exploit that weak pawn. So first thing you need to do if you're thinking positionally, you need to look at trying to improve the placing of your pieces. So you can ask yourself, all right, one, where are my pawn weaknesses? And you must say this about your opponent as well. Where are my pawn weaknesses? Two, which is my bad bishop and which is my good bishop? And three, which is my worst placed piece? Ask yourself those three questions. So first one is to know, do we have any pawn weaknesses as white? Let's have a look. Does anybody see any pawn weaknesses white? I'll give you a minute to look.
Can I say something?
Of course, yes.
The d4 pawn is isolated.
Which makes it a weakness, yes. A pawn that isn't defended by another pawn is a weakness. Because it can become a target. When pieces defended, fine, but remember, pawns being defended by, because this is 1 point defending 1. Here you will have something like 3 defending 1. You would prefer it if it was a pawn defending, right? Because then it's 1 point defending 1. You don't have to have this piece stuck to defending this. So good, white's weak pawn here. Which is white's. Now you must look at the black side. Does black have any bad pawns? Does black have any weak pawns? Sorry.
No, black does not have any weak pawns.
Correct. Another question you can also ask yourself, do I have, for you and your opponent, are there any weaknesses? And by that means looking at weak squares. Here you're not trying to find what you have that's good. You're trying to find what you have that is a problem, okay, when you think positionally, and then try to improve on it. Don't just think of attacking. Try and figure out your problems first. Improve them, and at the same time, try and put your pieces on better squares. So let's have a look at white. Do you see any weaknesses?
It's black to play, right?
It is black to play, but my question is weaknesses. Now, you see, you must ask these questions instead of just thinking about the playing. What I want to know is, are there any weaknesses for black? And not this time pawns, weaknesses like an outpost, for example, you see here, for white. Possibly. I mean here, sorry. Yeah, that's a weakness you have. That's a weakness for black. And a strength for you. Does white have any weakness? Oh, d5. That's weak for us. It's going to be strong for him. It's a problem. Ooh, this is also a weakness. So we've got 2 weaknesses we see here. Then we must come to our bishops.
You think that's in your thinking?
How do you tell a bad bishop from a good bishop?
One weakness for white could be the d5 square, because the knight actually it's an outpost. The knight controls so many squares from that outpost. And then for black, there are a few weaknesses, as like knight c5 could be played, or
Correct.
maybe
It's a weakness. Well done. Now, also, I want you to tell me, do any of you know how to tell the difference between what is a good bishop and what makes a bishop bad?
a bad bishop is a bishop that does not have much mobility, like it cannot move to a lot of squares. Like actually that black bishop on b2, it could also be kind of characterized like as a bad bishop. And we could also say the white bishop on f3, since it can only move to 2 squares, which can easily be vulnerable to g6.
You see, now you're not looking at this positionally now. Now you're starting to look at it incorrectly. Don't worry, this is something I did as well myself when I first began this. Same thing I said, probably more or less like you. Now, the way you tell the difference between a weak bishop and a strong one is by looking at pawns. Remember, when it comes to positional play, everything revolves around pawns. To be able to tell if you've got weaknesses, you look usually at the pawns first. Where are they? It's the first thing you look at. And now this pawn on d4, right? This makes this bishop weak. We don't have that problem for the white bishop. So this is our strong bishop. But remember you were saying it was like weak and all that a second ago? It's actually our strong bishop. Question that I ask is, how can you tell which is the strong one? So this makes this the weak one because of this pawn, which makes the light square bishop our strong one. Now for black, which one is the strong one and which one's the weak bishop? I just told you now. Remember, look at the pawns first. They can tell you which is a strong bishop and which one's the weak one.
The light squared bishop's the strong one and the dark squared's the weak one.
Are you referring to white or black?
For white.
That's correct. And for black?
The light, for black it's a little bit trickier, but in general, the dark squared's the stronger one and the light squared's the weaker one. But the light squared one is on a long open diagonal, so it's not as weak.
But still, now the question is which one is the weak and the strong one? It's not about the strength over there or anything. It's about being able to tell which is the weak and the strong. It would be the light square bishop is the weak one.
The stronger one and the light squared would be the weaker one because all these pawns are on light squares.
Exactly, because all the pawns are on light squares. Now, a goal of yours, so if you are black here, all right? Let's say, for example, you're black and I'm white here, okay? Your goal would be wanting to swap and exchange this one eventually for this piece, okay? Because you want to swap your weak one for my strong one. My goal would be I want to swap this one off for that bishop, because that's strong one. And your dark squared bishop is the strong one. So that's something you must remember to do in every game and ask yourself that question every single time. Then you need to look at which is the worst placed piece and then try to improve upon it. But we don't need to go further than that part over there. So just to finish the game. So he plays knight b6, trying to improve his pieces. h3. Sorry about that. So he plays there since h3. He doesn't, because since queen c2, this helps black. White wants to try avoid exchanging. Black wants to exchange because remember, we've got an isolated pawn here and it's the end game now. So Lasker's having a better game than Rubinstein because in the ending, if you still have this pawn here and the end game comes, it's going to become a big problem for you. it's going to be a weakness. So the more pieces that are swapped off, the more trouble you will get yourself into. Queen c8, d3, knight d5, threatening knight b4. Knight b4 because the idea is eventually to play queen c2 afterwards. We want to try because black wants to swap queens off, because when also you're playing and you look at it positionally, you need to see which is the strongest defender, and then you must try and exchange that off after you've seen everything else. That's your next one. Exchange off white's strongest defender, and that is the queen. A3 prevents knight b4, but you create, this is a weakness. Knight b6, a very strong move. d5. Now you're looking at that. And here you've got your problem again. Now, he's got the stronger bishop, but he's not interested in swapping off because he can swap off anytime he wants. Queen c3. Now, he's in distress. After all, he decides to give up the queen in exchange. And now he's going to succumb to the weaknesses that we have on the board that have arisen here. They're going to come and cost him the game. Takes, check. Takes, swapping pieces off. A4. Strong move, because now you need to look at where the pawns are placed and what pieces you have. Dark squared bishop, attacking the pawn. That's also being attacked. We play here, so this pawn doesn't move, and we always still have a target on it. Takes, king f1. Now, if you play b4 instead, takes, right there. Knight d5 wins. Because now you cannot stop the approach, because if the king starts chasing and coming around here, you always have knight c3. Because if you start pushing the pawns further, let's say white plays, let's add here maybe. Okay, let's go here instead. Plays there, he's got no choice. Then you simply play here, takes. And the idea is to play there, queen, and win the piece off. And then you'll win the game. The king is too slow. So let's play a bit differently. And yeah, we can stop there. And eventually, Rubinstein lost this game. But just to show you, it's about looking at it positionally. Look at pawns, where they're placed, to tell if there's a weakness, an outpost. Then you need to look at your bishops. Then you also need to figure out which one of them is the strong one and the weak one. Remember, look where the pawns are placed on. If they're on dark squares, that makes your dark square bishop weak. And if your dark square bishop is weak and your opponent's is strong, then one of your goals should be to try swap that bishop off for your opponent's. All right, so everyone. I hope for my first time you enjoyed the lesson, and I hope I didn't do too bad.
Thank you. You've given us a lot to think about. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the session. It was really good, David, I think. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, we can probably end it there.
If anyone has questions, you can ask me quickly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can send the guide on Facebook, hey, the link to the study, hey.
Yeah,
Not on Facebook, on
yeah, I will
WhatsApp.
share this on
Yeah,
WhatsApp.
I
Thank you.
typed pretty much most of this out, or almost all of it, yeah, so it should be helpful. If
Thank
you
you.
want to,
Yeah.
in my opinion, if I can say, if you want to learn this type of stuff and really be good, I would say look at getting My Systems and Praxis by Aaron Nimzovich. That is a fantastic book. Read it from the beginning to the end, and it can help you jump from being a, let's just say, a 1200 rated to a 1900. You read it enough and you understand it, and it's a phenomenal book. And another good one to study, which is something I bought, is by Igor Smirnov, his Positional Chess Play. Very good as well. But
Cool, thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Okay. Thank you everyone for coming, and then enjoy your evening.